That intro clip comes from the founder of Runners Connect and the guest on today's show, Coach Jeff Gaudette. It probably wasn't the first time you heard about the importance of consistency, but sometimes life just gets in the way. What if you know though ahead of time that you're going to miss some training? Should you throw in extra runs to make up for it? This is a strategy I like to call banking mileage, and today we're unpacking how it works and whether or not it's an effective strategy to implement in your own training. But first, I do want to apologize, as during the recording, one of Jeff's neighbors actually left their dog outside, and you might hear just a little bit of barking in the background. I don't think it's too noticeable, and I really hope that you enjoy today's conversation. So on that note, let's get into the interview. Jeff, happy to have you back with us on the podcast. How you doing?
Fantastic. It's great to be here. First podcast of the year for me, so I'm excited to be with you guys.
That's true. I totally forgot. We're all the way in February by the time this airs, but it's been a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to chat with you.
Cool. So I think we're going to get a little bit more into this concept of banking mileage throughout the episode, which is really our focus today. But it kind of hit me before I hit the record button. I don't even know if this is actually a technical term or just something I thought of. So let's start there. Is this actually something you've heard before?
I would say that it is. I don't know that it's like super technical, but I definitely would say that I've heard of it before and I know people do it. So you're definitely thinking in the right direction for sure.
All right. Yeah. And I think a lot of people listening, their heads will probably go right to banking time, which I think is definitely a concept runners will have heard of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, maybe I'll just spell it out a little bit before we fully get into a definition later on in the episode. But I think really the focus here today is this principle of trying to fit in more miles to make up for maybe not training as much in the future, which I think is probably particularly relevant to our audience, a lot of which are not professional athletes who have all the time to run. So you're probably going to have some workouts over the course of a training cycle that you miss.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think in the case of the athletes that we work with and like you said, like non-elites, I definitely think banking mileage or having parts of the year where you're training harder or more than others just because of the way your schedule allows is definitely a much more common situation than you'll find in like the quote unquote elite circles, people that do this professionally. So
do you think you could almost think of the extreme of this as being the weekend warrior, like trying to bank mileage for the entire rest of the week?
Yeah, so there's definitely that side of it. I think what we'll talk about more is more like longer periods of training where you're kind of doing more than you might normally. But you're right, like the weekend warrior where it's like I have 3 days to train, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then like the rest of the week I really can't train. That's a little bit of a different situation, and we can kind of get into that a little bit. But my concept of banking mileage is more along the lines of anywhere from a 2 to 6 week period where you're putting in more training than you might normally would, and part of it being planned in that way.
Yeah, so let's talk about what it actually means to get an increased mileage. And to do that, we have to start with what mileage even really is. Are we talking about distance, time, or something entirely different here?
Yeah, so I think it doesn't matter how you quantify it. So I would say that most people use volume, so mileage, kilometers, to track their training. But you can also do it in terms of time. There's benefits to doing, there's pros and cons to both tracking by time and tracking by volume. I prefer the volume method. I think it's just a little bit cleaner. It's a way to, I think, stay a little bit more accurate. But time is definitely helpful as well, especially if you're somebody who becomes numbers obsessed, whether that be like always needing to hit a certain mileage total or running too fast. So that kind of stuff. Like if you struggle with that, I definitely think running by minutes or time is better. Whereas I think usually mileage is a little bit easier to track, especially if you're going to do like a supercompensation cycle, like kind of what we're talking like banking mileage. I think it's a little bit better if you track mileage, just because it gives you a little bit more accurate picture of like what you're actually doing.
Yeah, and I think not to detour too much here, but presumably if we're talking about sort of getting in a higher fitness stimulus in advance of the period where you're going to be potentially doing less, that might even apply to something like biking or cross training where you're not doing mileage. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think sometimes that's where I think as runners, we just kind of quantify everything as running as that's training. And then everything else we do outside of that is not training. But I've always looked at it, and I think, I can't remember what coach explained it to me this way, but we kind of have to look at our energy totals as like a gas tank. And so everything that we do, whether it be training, whether it be the running training, whether it be cross training, strength training, and even stuff outside of training itself, all of that depletes our energy in some way. And so, there is a finite amount that we have. And obviously we can have more energy if we focus more on sleep and recovery and et cetera. But all of that stuff does add up. And so you have to take it all into account when you're, especially when you're increasing your training volume like this. You do need to keep that all into account, that everything starts to come into play. So absolutely, it's not just running.
Yeah, let's maybe hone in a little bit more on what distinguishes banking miles from maybe just going out and doing more. And you use some words like planned, I think, but what exactly differentiates those two things?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely a definition where it's very fickle, or there's a very thin line. And so I think, the way I kind of describe, the way I think about it is, in order for banking mileage to be effective or something that's going to work well and not lead to burnout, injury, that kind of thing, it has to be planned in the way where you are going to have a period after you quote unquote bank the mileage where you have a reduction in training. And the reason for that is, if we look at a normal training cycle, we want to kind of impose a little bit of apply a training stimulus, which in effect breaks us down. And then we want to have a recovery period where that builds us back up. And so in a normal kind of training phase, it's a little bit of breakdown, a little bit of build up, kind of like this. In this type of training, like if we're looking at doing like a mileage block, we're going to do a lot of breakdown. And then because of that, we need a lot of time to recover and a lot of time to allow our body to build back up. And so when we say planned, it means you're not just going out there and doing more training and then going to go back to status quo. It needs to be something where there is a planned recovery period after this, whether it be forced in the sense of because you're going on vacation, work, not going to be able to train for something. That needs to be kind of applied to this principle for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And is there sort of a minimum increase or duration of time if you had to put, say, like a percentage on it?
I don't think there's something that's going to universally apply to everybody. But I think a good rule of thumb would be you would want equal time recovery for the amount of time that you're doing, extra mileage or a supercompensation period. So if you did like 3 weeks of mileage banking or supercompensation, you would probably want 2 to 3 weeks of extra recovery to kind of try to make up for that. So I would say anywhere from 75% to 100% of the time that you took building or going into a period where you're banking mileage.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So maybe I'll get into some of the reasons why a runner might choose to bank miles, which I think usually comes back to knowing that you're going to be missing training for one reason or another. So what is the actual impact of missing, say, a single workout, and then compare that to, maybe there's a week where you're going to be doing less training or missing training entirely?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think it's to start. I think one thing to ease the fear of almost all runners, and even when you know this data, it's still hard to apply, but like missing a single workout or even 3 or 4 days from a physiological perspective does absolutely nothing to your fitness. You don't lose any of the physiological markers that we would look at, generally speaking, when we think about training. Like you don't lose really anything, especially one workout, even up to 3 to 4 days. There's really no fitness loss whatsoever. The way I like to describe it to people is if we imagined our running fitness as a big bucket. So every time we did a workout or a run or whatever, we were adding a drop to that bucket. So, and that's where kind of consistency comes into play. So if you imagine over the course of months and months and months, you just continue to drop buckets into that, drops of water into that bucket. And missing one drop of water is going to really have no effect on kind of what that bucket looks like when it comes to race day. Your bucket will still be almost as full as it would have been, or negligible if you missed a workout or two. Where you do start seeing some loss in physiological parameters is, when we start getting into like 7 days, 10 days, 2 weeks, that kind of stuff. And so there is actually some data on kind of what you might lose like that in particular time period. So again, 1 to 7 days, you're going to lose negligible reduction in really any physiological biomarkers or any measurements that we take. From 10 to 14 days. So if you miss 10 to 14 days, and this would be like no running at all, a lot of the studies have shown, combination of studies have shown that there's about a 6% reduction in your VO2 max. So to give you an idea of what that means, 6% is a lot and it isn't a lot. And I'll get into why it's not a lot in the end. But so for example, if you are a 20-minute 5K runner, so if your PR is 20 minutes, a 6% reduction in your VO2 max would put you in about 21:05 shape, 05 shape. So, you're losing about a minute if you took 14 days off of your 5K. So if you took 14 days off and then had to go run another 5K, you'd be about a minute slower. Now, if you take about 30 days off, so anywhere from like 25 to 30 days, there's a 12% reduction in VO2 max. So you'd be going from a 20-minute 5K to about a 23-minute 5K. So losing 3 minutes. Now, that sounds like a lot. And from a pure time perspective, it definitely is. But you have to remember that it's not going to take quite as long to get back into that 20-minute 5K shape or to get back into your peak fitness. I know we're planning to talk about this, but generally speaking, it's about half the time to get back to where you were. I think there were some studies done on this, and like I said, the studies show that it takes about 70% of the time, or I guess 30% of the time, to get back to where you were. So if you let's say that even at 14 days, you lost 6% of your VO2 max, it would probably take you about anywhere from 7 to 10 days to get back into 20-minute 5K shape or to regain that fitness that you lost. So even though it sounds like, when you look at the time, like it sounds like a pretty big reduction in your fitness, it's really not, because of how quickly you can get it back once you're able to come back. And all these studies are on people that did no running or no physical activity during that time off. So it mostly applies to like injured people. So like if you had a period where you just reduced your volume and reduced your training, obviously the impact is going to be even less than it would be if you were injured and took 2 weeks off completely. So I know that's kind of a lot of numbers to throw out there, but hopefully people could follow along a little bit with what I was trying to say there.
All right, I think that's a pretty cool insight, that you actually get fitness back faster than you lose it. So just to use a practical example of a runner taking, we'll say, 2 weeks completely off, does that mean it only takes a few days of running in order for you to get back to where you were fitness-wise before?
Yeah, so like I said, in the example that I was trying to give with the data, if you took up to 14 days off, you lose about a minute from your fitness, like as a 20-minute 5K, or so you lose about 6% of your fitness, but you would get about 75% of that fitness back within like half the time. So with, again, trying to apply numbers to it, you'd be back at like 220 shape within half that time. So within a few days, really, within a week, you'd be pretty much back to where you were. Maybe, a slight reduction in that would be peak fitness. So really not quite as long as I think we all fear when we take time off. Like, we kind of, and the reason for that, why it feels so much worse than it really is from a physiological perspective, is that when we look at like the physiological parameters of when we measure like what you're losing in fitness, most of it comes from VO2 max. Like that's usually, like in physiological terms, like when we measure fitness, like that's kind of what we look at, VO2 max. But fitness, there's a lot that goes into running fitness. So it's not just VO2 max. There's a lot of physiological parameters that go into that. But the biggest one in terms of like why it feels so crappy is because a lot of it comes from like neurological, from our muscles brain connection. So that deteriorates really quickly. And so, but it also comes back really quickly. So when you first get out there, there's a lot of like neurological degeneration that happens so quickly that the first few runs that you come back, it feels terrible because your body is trying to kind of bring that system back. But the good thing is that system comes back really quick. It really only takes like 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 runs to kind of get that out of your system. And then you can get back more into the I guess the deeper physiological values, VO2 max, that kind of stuff. And that again takes a little bit longer, but to degenerate, but also is pretty fast to come back. So.
And I'm going to take a small detour here, which could really be an entire podcast in and of itself. But is it fair to say that that principle you just described of kind of the neuromuscular memory, or whatever the term was, going quickly, is that why you often feel so crappy during the taper?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So that's a big part of it. And especially if you do the taper wrong, when you kind of take too when you drop your mileage too much or take a few days off before the race, like that's a big reason that people feel so terrible sometimes on race day, is that neurological system deteriorates so quickly. But again, it's not really a fitness thing. It's just more like how you feel.
And does it go the other way too? Like, is it possible to think that you're doing exactly the right taper because you feel really good, but actually be working too hard?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I would say that not tapering enough is not a problem we encounter too much. Honestly, like we usually see it on the other end, but absolutely that can happen.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. And then one other thing in terms of how quickly you lose fitness, you pretty specifically called out that that's for a runner who's doing absolutely no training. And I think we've talked a lot on the show and how those rates of losing fitness vary depending on whether you're doing no training or a little bit of training. But on the other end of it, is there any research to indicate whether you get fitness back at different rates depending on what that rest period looked like?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any specific research, but I would definitely say that the fitness will come back faster if you are able to do something, in terms of why you took time off. If you were just completely on the couch or injured and couldn't do anything, or if you were able to. There's a big difference if you were able to cross train. And again, that gets back into the fact that most of what you'll be like missing or needing to get back is that neuromuscular fitness. If you are able to cross train. So if you're able to do pool running or biking or something like that, you're not going to lose a lot of the like aerobic, anaerobic components of your physiological fitness, so you can maintain them pretty easily. What you'll kind of just need to get is quote unquote your legs back under you, that neurological fitness, and so that will come back in 2 or 3 days, and then you'll be able to, the losses from the physiological factors, VO2 max, lactate threshold, that kind of stuff, is going to stay pretty consistent if you're able to do cross training.
Yeah, and say the break itself is a lot of cross training. Do you even need to super compensate, or is it really just the neuromuscular piece that you're losing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that you would need to super compensate if you're going to be able to cross train, because I don't think you're going to be banking that much fitness to make it worth the risk. So there is a risk to banking fitness, and so you kind of have to weigh the risk reward there of like what's going to be the risk if I do this versus the gain. So it kind of depends on what your situation is.
And how do you make that evaluation? I think, aside from having a coach to direct you, my mentality often as a runner has been kind of fit in as much as you can while you have the time. But of course, that often leads to burnout or injury.
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. That this is definitely one of those times where a coach is really, really helpful, because they can be an objective look at your data and yourself and say this is going to work for you. I would say that if you're going to make that decision, you really have to be honest with yourself about your injury history, how easily you get injured, what you're going to be able to do in the time period that you're off, like banking mileage, like what you have coming up. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I think the most important thing is to be honest with yourself. So if you're somebody that is often injured or coming off a period where you were in a really bad injury cycle, I think the risk reward probably isn't there. If you're somebody who is generally healthy, hasn't had a major injury in a long time, and then you're going into a situation where, let's say you're trying to qualify for Boston, and this is like one of your best opportunities, then the risk might be worth it in that particular case. So you kind of have to measure a couple different variables there to see what's going to be the best for you. But yeah, I definitely think that's when it just comes down to being honest with yourself.
I used to have a coach who told me the best prediction of your future risk of getting injured is your past injury history. Is that a fair statement? And then if it is a fair statement, does that mean that this whole banking mileage thing is really only more applicable to runners who don't get injured a lot?
So I would definitely say that that's true. I think if you're somebody that's often injured, like there is probably a reason for it. And until you kind of fix a lot of those underlying issues, I think obviously the chances of you getting injured again increase. That said, I wouldn't say that banking fitness isn't an option for people that are often injured. I would just say that it's a training concept that you probably have to use a little bit more sparingly. Whereas if somebody that doesn't, you can probably get away with it a lot more. So I think that kind of goes to both ends. Like, again, you just have to be honest with yourself about whether this, so like, let me actually bring this back to like more of a macro thing. Like, there are just some training concepts, workouts, training styles that just won't work for some people. It could be an injury, it could be your lifestyle, could be whatever it is. Like, there's just some things that just won't work quite as well for you as they will for somebody else. So absolutely, banking fitness might not be a situation that is worth the risk in particular cases. Just like, honestly, like even training for a marathon, for some people just isn't the right time. They shouldn't be doing it at this particular point in their training cycle or history, whatever. So
yeah, really interesting to hear you say that, because so much of our clientele here at Runners Connect are training for a marathon. Do you sometimes make recommendations to runners to step down in distance depending on their training schedules?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we do get a lot of people that initially sign up and they say, oh, I'm going to do the marathon in 20 weeks or whatever. And we look at like where they're at, and it's just like, we basically the way we approach it is we tell them, we say, look, I don't think that this is going to be the best mileage progression for you. We will certainly help you and try to get you there as safely as possible, because my outlook on it is that people are probably going to do it regardless, whether they have our guidance or not. And our hope is that by giving them at least a SMART program, we can at least get them to the starting line healthy and being able to finish the race strong. So we try to balance, like, okay, this is your goal. And then we try to balance that with, okay, this is the, what we call is taking the next logical step. So this is the next logical step in your progression. And we try to balance those two and try to get them where they need to be. But I would say absolutely happens quite a bit.
So for that runner maybe who's not in a position, the way their lifestyle is set up to train for a marathon, if they come to you and say, hey, I'm going to miss the next 2, maybe 3 weeks, how do I get enough training to make it worthwhile? Now, is your response sometimes, no, just do less, it's not worth training for the marathon?
Yeah, that, and I would say that I think the first conversation we always have with people that is like, we need to adjust your expectations, what your expectations are for this race. I think that's the biggest thing, is like just making sure that the athlete has their goal or their expectations for their race are aligned with where their fitness is at and the time that they're going to have to train. I think those are two big things. So as long as that's aligned, so like we'll chat with the athlete and say, look, if you're expecting the PR, probably not the right situation. Like, it's probably better to put yourself in a situation, like if you want a PR, to put yourself in at a time period where you can train the right way. But there are certainly a lot of people that just want to finish, or this is one of those destination races. There's a thing where, maybe they don't need to necessarily PR. They just want to have a good time, whatever. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. But absolutely, yeah, I think you need to manage expectations about what your goal is versus what you're able to do in training.
I think that's great advice. I do want to transition over to that runner who's in PR mode and maybe in the right life circumstances to gun for that PR. We're talking today about banking mileage, which you've said it's kind of used in the running community, but maybe not a scientific term. But there are some adjacent terms that I think are very related that are maybe more specifically defined in the running community. And a couple that come to mind are supercompensation and overreaching, both of which have to do with this idea of putting in extra training and maybe even beyond what you can do at a sustainable level. So I guess reflecting on those terms, how would you define them each, and how do they relate or differ to this concept of banking fitness?
Yeah. So I think the most common term would be like supercompensation training. I think the biggest difference in my mind is that when I think of somebody saying banking fitness, I think of them as saying that going into or doing extra mileage, volume, whatever, because they're going to need some type of time off afterwards. Like, whereas supercompensation training is a little bit more, I guess I want to say it's like more structured in the sense that it's really more focused on the physiological principles. So like you're targeting something specifically physiologically, and not doing it just because this is what the schedule kind of forced on you, kind of, if that makes sense. So I think there's just slight differences. You're just you're kind of doing somewhat of the same thing, but you're just kind of attacking it in a little bit of a different way, just based on like the reason that you're doing it, really.
And how does supercompensation then differ from just doing more training? Because surely if I just go out and run 120 miles every week, that's not supercompensation, is it?
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. So it's definitely a more structured and more planned approach than even banking fitness. Like when I think of banking fitness, I think of it more as just like mostly mileage. Like you're not going to necessarily probably increase the intensity or volume of your workouts. It's more just you're increasing mileage. Like, that's how I think of banking fitness. Whereas super compensation training, one thing is generally speaking, probably a little bit short of a time period. But also it's more, again, focused on trying to get a specific physiological outcome. So it could be a mileage thing where you're just trying to get your mileage up, like trying to break through a plateau in mileage wise. A lot of times it's centered around intensity. So doing a pretty high bout of intensity. So like 10 days, maybe 2 weeks of like super high intensity training. But then, like I mentioned at the start, it's balanced by a equally super compensation recovery. So you're kind of building that in, generally speaking, and and again, because you're trying to get that specific physiological outcome, whether it be breaking through a mileage barrier, breaking through an intensity barrier, putting in something specific intensity wise, that kind of thing. Those are the kind of how I think of the differences. So a little bit more structured, I think, on the super compensation side.
Yeah, and you touched on it not being just mileage. Can you super compensate using only intensity and actually not touch your mileage at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So you see this a little bit with elites. We'll do this often, especially elites that in the track season that are going to Europe, well, from the US going to Europe, or doing some type of, like, a lot of the track races early on are it's close together. So if you're running in the Olympics and you got heats and rounds and things like that, you'll see athletes a lot of times will do a super compensation period before they leave to go overseas or while they're there before the competition starts. And that way they use the time when they are in between races. So let's say over a 2 week span, they may have a bunch of different races. Like they won't be training much during that period. It's mostly race and recover. So they did the super compensation part beforehand in order to get their fitness kind of where it needed to be. And then they used the racing cycle or plan as like a recovery period.
I've heard this before because you are kind of forced to taper a little bit or skip some workouts when you're racing, but it still feels kind of bizarre to think of your racing season as being something you have to super compensate for just because those races are that one time where you're really fully tapping into your energy stores and using 100% effort.
Yeah, and especially in the case of like elite track athletes where again, especially something special like the World Championships or Olympics or things like that, where you have three races or three races in 5 days or 2 races in 4 days, something like that. You kind of the taper for that or the lead up to that is a lot different than a marathon where it's just you're really just training for one day. Or a lot of cases again, like people will go to Europe and over a 3-4 week span they may race like 8 times, especially milers, things like that. So it's a little bit different than I think a lot of probably recreational adult athletes will get into, but there's definitely times where that applies.
Yeah, and how much in terms of the fitness level of an elite does banking fitness still apply? And the context I'm coming from is I wonder if you're actually more fit and you've done more training, does that affect the rate at which you're going to lose fitness then if you take a break or a reduction in mileage?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never seen anything with data on it. But I would say that, that you probably would, I don't think it's necessarily that you lose fitness slower, or at a less rapid rate. I think it's just, it allows you to extend the period from which you can maximize your fitness or you can maximize the results that you put in. So I think that's where it comes in. So it's not like you do a super compensation period and then all of a sudden you're like much fitter than you've ever been. That's kind of not how it works. You're actually probably in quote unquote worse fitness because you just need to recover. So it's one of those things that you're almost taking advantage of the fact that you need to recover or that you need to have time off. Because during that super compensation period or that banking fitness, you are putting yourself in a hole, literally, like you're digging yourself into a hole and you're coming out of that hole by recovering and either not doing as much training or being on a taper, that kind of thing. So it's kind of almost like the opposite. You're just not fitter. You're able to extend the period at which you decline your fitness.
Do you typically think of that sort of 5 to 3 weeks out from marathon as being a period where you want to be super compensating just because you have that rest coming up, or is that kind of a different concept than super compensation?
Yeah, so that's kind of how we do it. From about 6 to 3 weeks is generally speaking when we have the hardest block of training. I wouldn't say that it's super compensation, only in the idea that to me, super compensation is like going out of the ordinary. I would just say that during that period is when you're doing the most of you're going to have the most volume, probably your hardest workouts, etc. And then you're right. And because then we're able to, as soon as we hit that 3 week mark, we start to taper off the volume or the intensity a little bit, more the intensity than the volume. And so, yes, we're building in the fact that over the next 3 weeks, you're going to really take a pretty significant recovery. And that way you're going to able to maximize that fitness. So I think everybody always thinks that, marathon training, especially if you're doing it at a high level, is really a tightrope walk the whole way of, doing just enough not to get into that overtrained, injured area, and just enough that you can still recover from it. And so because we know we're taking that break at the end, we can push it a little bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of runners who have done multiple marathon blocks know that feeling where you can almost feel that the training you're doing is unsustainable, but you do it anyways, knowing that you have that taper at the end before race day.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. You're trying to get to that point where you can recover and absorb all that training that you put in.
Yeah. All right, so let's help myself, but also runners listening, figure out if this whole banking mileage thing is actually for them and their circumstances. And really, whether you're talking about that or super compensation, it seems to all come down to this idea of sort of mileage fluctuation or distribution, because ultimately if you're putting in more training, you need that rest at some point. So what is it really that matters most in your training? Is it how much volume you're getting in? Is it just how high you can get, that peak training? Or is it really consistency in that distribution that matters most?
Yeah, to me, it's the consistency. So 100%. Like a month of consistent, like average training, if you're consistent with it, will outdo 2 weeks of really awesome training and 2 weeks of crappy training every time. Consistency is definitely better. And even that's that's still like a short time period, like a month. That's obviously long, but not that long. Like the more you lengthen it out, so when you start getting to like years, or 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, like the consistency over time matters more and more and more and more. So the longer the time frame, the more consistency becomes, the greater the importance you put on consistency. The shorter the time frame, the more you can play with the fluctuation and have less overall impact on your fitness. So I think if anybody really thinks about it, I think that probably makes sense. Like if anybody thinks about like when they were in their best shape ever, running wise, fitness wise, whatever, health wise, it's been through consistency. It's been like, oh, I did 6 months of like, I was on point for 6 months. Like you come out of that and you probably think back and like, oh, I never really did anything crazy. I was just consistent for 6 months, and you're probably in your best fitness. Whereas if you think back to the times where you probably went a little crazy with your training or did something crazy, but then had to take 2 weeks off for an injury or whatever, like you can, at the end of the day, you're always like, you always feel like you're on that line. Like, I don't know if I'm really fit or not. Like, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. So to me, consistency is 100% the way to go. If that would always be my first choice, would be consistency. But then again, we definitely don't live in a world where that's always possible for everybody. So sometimes we just have to do the best with what we're working with.
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably some runners listening who might be thinking that they've taken months or years off, but at least he's super compensated with the years before that. But I guess it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, exactly. Anytime you start lengthening the time periods like that, it gets more difficult.
My dreams of taking my 30s off and still running crazy fast marathons have been dashed.
Yes, definitely.
All right, so let's kind of tie this in a neat bow. We've gone through a lot of concepts here and sort of what are the net impact of a rest period and taking time off, and then maybe trying to bank mileage before that. But in general, for runners who have the circumstances to get in the training, is it an effective strategy to try to bank fitness, or should your ultimate goal to be consistent across the training block?
Yeah, so I think the ultimate goal should just be to be as consistent as possible. I think that's what every athlete should strive to do with their training. I also find that to be more sustainable. But that said, banking fitness does have its use cases for when I see this a lot if people are going into like a surgery that's not like running related or something like that. Like if they have a health thing that's not serious, but they're going to be laid up for a week, banking fitness going into that. Or like you said, if you know you're going to be on a week long work trip where you're just not going to be able to train quite as much, to bank a little bit of fitness going in so that you use that week as a super compensation to recover. So there are time periods where it makes sense, but the goal should be consistency.
Yeah, and I think one thing I like to do a lot in my training blocks is to have sort of 2 to 3 week builds and then a week off. So when you talk about being consistent in a training block, are you better off sort of being completely consistent, or is your definition of consistency sort of moving throughout a training block?
So that's a great question. I've always referred to that as like a scheduled down week. And that's a little bit of a different, like that's one of those nuances, and I think that's different. That is still being consistent. Because in those cases, like it's not like you're doing nothing during that week. Like you're just reducing the volume by a smaller percentage, reducing the intensity, that kind of stuff. That is different. And in the case, and actually in a lot of cases, that actually helps with consistency because it allows you to maintain the more intense weeks of training. So again, it gets into that over the course of, let's say, 12 weeks. If 3 of those weeks were a little bit less intense or a little bit less volume, that's a small drop when it comes to being completely consistent for 12 weeks. So yeah, I consider those a little bit different than intentionally banking fitness and then for time that you're not going to be able to train.
All right, one more thing I want to do is use a specific example because I think it's helpful to illustrate how this might look for a runner. So let's say, John Doe has been training super consistently, trying to get ready for the Boston Marathon in April. And then I think as we're recording this, the next break usually is sort of the March break period if you have kids. So say John Doe is planning to take a vacation in March, not planning to bring running shoes and do any training. How would you kind of tweak the schedule versus if it was just going to be status quo?
Yeah, great question. So I would probably do something where anywhere from 10 to 14 days before he goes on his break, I would definitely have a more intense period of training. Obviously, the exact numbers would be based on what he would be able to handle and what he was coming from. But absolutely, I would bank that fitness, like do maybe some extra intensity, or I shouldn't say extra intensity, but volume. Definitely have some intensity and more intense workouts than we may be used to. And then use that week where he wasn't training as a quote unquote super compensation recovery. And then when he comes back, we would just try to get back to that same consistency.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's super helpful, especially myself included. I think a lot of people listening are going to be training for spring races, and probably at some point or another, you're going to have some breaks in there. Sometime you're going to miss training. So, Jeff, this has been great, and appreciate you sharing some insights on how to spread that mileage around and stay as consistent as possible.
No problem. Always happy to chat, and sorry for everybody listening for the dog. Hopefully it wasn't too annoying, but it happens.
You're lucky I'm a dog lover.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure having you on.
Thanks, Corey.